It was during the chaotic evacuation of New Orleans in 2005, amid the floods of Hurricane Katrina that swallowed entire neighborhoods, turned streets into raging rivers, and tested the limits of human endurance in ways that still haunt my dreams, that I first understood how silence could be a weapon sharper than any blade, how saying nothing in the face of chaos often preserved strength for the moments that truly mattered. My name is Tom Harper, a former Marine major who served in places where the line between life and death was drawn in the sand or etched in the mud of foreign battlefields. I'd come home from those tours with a body marked by scars and a mind that preferred the quiet rhythm of routine over the clamor of crowds. From the very beginning of her entrance into our family, my son's fiancée, Hannah Reed, mistook my quiet habits for some kind of frailty or irrelevance. She saw my old Jeep, with its faded green paint and reliable engine that had carried me through countless miles of backroads and bad weather, as nothing more than a rusty eyesore parked in the driveway. My worn work jacket, patched from years of use in the field and now hanging in the garage like a silent sentinel, became fodder for her sly remarks during family dinners. And my preference for silence, those long pauses where I listened more than I spoke, letting the weight of words settle before responding, she interpreted as hesitation or worse, weakness. She even joked about my shakes, those subtle tremors in my hands from old injury sustained in a helicopter crash during a night op, dismissing them as quirks of an outdated veteran. She laughed about my belongings, calling them outdated relics from a bygone era, as if they were museum pieces rather than tools that had seen real action. All the while, I held firm to the belief that true respect is proven by actions, not by flashy ornaments, expensive suits, or the kind of superficial polish she seemed to value above all else. I didn't correct her assumptions right away. I'd learned long ago that some lessons are best taught through example, not argument. The early warnings were soft but clear. Hannah floated cutting my speech from the rehearsal dinner, made light of veteran episodes, and asked my son not to seat me near her agency friends, to preserve the aesthetic. That's when the thought took root. It began with little things, the kind that don't set off alarms immediately but sting enough to linger, building like distant thunder on a clear day. The rehearsal dinner was meant to be a warm gathering, a prelude to the wedding where family and friends could share stories and toasts under the soft glow of string lights in a rented hall overlooking the harbor. I had prepared my words carefully, drawing from years of reflection, a simple acknowledgement of the bond between a father and his son, the trials we'd weathered together, and a quiet welcome to the woman who would join our family. It was a tradition I held dear, rooted in the values of honor and continuity that had guided me through my time as a Marine major. But as I stood to speak, clearing my throat amid the clink of glasses and murmurs of conversation, I caught Hannah's eyes narrowing in swift dismissal. Her lips curled just slightly, a subtle signal of impatience that spoke volumes. Later that evening, after the plates had been cleared and guests began to drift away, my son pulled me aside in the parking lot, his face flushed with awkwardness. He confessed that Hannah had suggested I keep my speech short, or better yet, skip it altogether. She claimed it would disrupt the flow of the evening, making things too heavy for what was supposed to be a light, celebratory affair. Her words, relayed through him, felt like a calculated erasure, as if my presence and my history were mere inconveniences to her perfectly orchestrated event. That wasn't an isolated incident. Hannah had a way of shrinking me, bit by bit, in front of others, turning my experiences into fodder for her casual sarcasm. She made light of what she called my veteran episodes, those unpredictable moments when the echoes of old battles surfaced. Perhaps in a slight tremor of my hands or a brief lapse into silence as memories flooded back. To her, these were nothing more than quirks, weaknesses to poke fun at during gatherings. I'd hear her joking with her friends over cocktails, mimicking a shaky hand or rolling her eyes as she quipped about old soldiers and their stories. It was dismissive, a way of invalidating the scars I carried, both visible and hidden, from years of service in places where survival depended on discipline and quiet resolve. Each remark chipped away at the respect I had earned, not through words, but through actions that had saved lives and protected those under my command. But the disrespect went beyond jokes, it seeped into deliberate exclusions that revealed her true priorities. She whispered to my son, urging him not to seat me near her agency friends, at social events, a carefully curated circle of polished professionals she valued for their status and connections. I overheard her more than once during what were meant to be private conversations, her voice low but insistent, "We need to preserve the aesthetic, you know? Your dad, he's great, but he doesn't exactly fit with the vibe." It was as if my weathered work jacket, my preference for straightforward talk, and my unassuming demeanor were threats to the image she was building. These friends of hers, with their tailored suits and easy laughter about market trends, represented the world she aspired to, one where appearances trumped substance. Seating me nearby, she feared, would disrupt that illusion, making her look less sophisticated in their eyes. One evening, after yet another family dinner where her barbs had flown under the radar of polite conversation, I retreated to the garage. The space was my sanctuary, filled with tools and mementos from a life of purpose, old maps from deployments, a faded photograph of my unit under a stormy sky, and that worn work jacket hanging on a hook like a silent guardian. I ran my fingers over its fabric, feeling the patches where I'd mended it after rough nights in the field, each thread a testament to endurance. Hannah had laughed at it once, calling it a relic from the Stone Age, in front of my son, as if it were something to be discarded rather than honored. That was the moment the realization sharpened into certainty, taking root deep in my core. It was more than a personal insult, it was a warning sign of a deeper fracture, a portent of storms ahead in what should have been a unified family. If she could so easily dismiss the pieces of my history, the jacket that had shielded me through chaos, the episodes that were badges of survival, what would she do when real challenges arose? Respect, I had learned through decades of leading men into uncertainty, was not something granted lightly or demanded by charm and polish. It was earned in the quiet moments, carried on the shoulders of those who acted without fanfare, and defended when others faltered. Hannah's behavior echoed patterns I'd seen in strained relationships, where one person's disregard eroded the foundation, leaving only resentment in its wake. I chose silence often, a warrior's way of observing the battlefield before committing to action. It was a tactic honed in the Marines, where rash words could cost lives, and patience revealed the true lay of the land. But inside, I was already preparing, bracing for the possibility that this house, with its familiar creaks and memories etched into every corner, might no longer be a place for her. The gulf between us was growing, filled with unspoken truths that echoed louder than any argument. As the days turned into weeks, those early warnings compounded. Hannah's subtle manipulations became more apparent, the way she would steer conversations away from my input, dismissing my advice on practical matters like home repairs or financial planning with a patronizing smile, as if my years of experience were outdated relics. She'd nag my son about updating our family traditions, suggesting we replace them with her more modern ideas, all while belittling the values I had instilled in him: discipline, loyalty, quiet strength. It was a form of emotional invalidation, making me feel like an outsider in my own home, my feelings minimized or rejected outright. There were moments when I saw the toll on my son. His eyes would flicker with conflict, caught between the woman he believed he loved and the father who had always been his anchor. I'd catch him hesitating during her jabs, his laughter forced, his posture tense as he tried to bridge the divide. In quieter times, when it was just the two of us working on the old Jeep in the driveway, he'd open up slightly, admitting the pressure he felt to keep the peace. But he never fully acknowledged how her disrespect was chipping away at our bond, how it mirrored the strained father-son dynamics I'd witnessed in others, where generational differences and unspoken pains created rifts that widened over time. I reflected on my own relationship with my father, a man of few words who had taught me that true connection came not from grand gestures but from shared silence and mutual respect. Hannah's approach was the opposite, a whirlwind of surface-level charm that masked a disregard for boundaries and feelings. She pressured my son into choices that distanced him from me, like skipping our traditional fishing trips to attend her networking events, framing it as progress, while subtly criticizing my old-fashioned ways. In the stillness of nights when sleep evaded me, I pondered the signs of disrespect that experts might label: manipulation through exclusion, criticism veiled as humor, a callous indifference to another's pain. It wasn't just about me, it was about the health of the family we were building. Fathers and sons often struggled to connect deeply, especially when external forces pulled them apart, but I refused to let that happen without a fight, even if my fight was waged in quiet resolve. The thought of confrontation loomed, but I held back, knowing that action spoke louder. Instead, I focused on being the steady presence my son needed, demonstrating through example that respect was the bedrock of any lasting relationship. Yet, deep down, I knew the line had been drawn. This home, with its history of quiet endurance, would not bend to superficial demands. It would stand as a boundary, a lesson in what truly mattered when the noise faded. And so, the early warnings lingered, soft but insistent, shaping the path ahead. I was ready for whatever came next, grounded in the knowledge that silence could indeed be the sharpest weapon. The breaking point didn't come at a memorial barbecue but at a waterfront charity gala in Charleston. Buoyed by applause and Prosecco, Hannah called my medals vintage scrap and said, "Markets are built by the bold, not by those who follow orders," and an elderly Coast Guard captain slipped out as the marina wind whistled. The evening started like so many others in Charleston, with the salty breeze off the harbor carrying the promise of a refined gathering. The waterfront charity gala was held at an elegant venue overlooking the marina, where yachts bobbed gently under the twilight sky, their lights reflecting on the water like scattered stars. It was an event dedicated to honoring search and rescue teams, those unsung heroes who braved storms and darkness to pull lives from the brink. I had been invited not as a guest of honor, but through old connections from my Marine days, networks that lingered like faint echoes of past deployments. My son, ever the dutiful bridge between his fiancée's world and mine, had convinced me to attend, framing it as a chance for family unity. Hannah, with her agency ties to high society donors, saw it as an opportunity to network, her Prosecco glass never far from her manicured hand. As a former Marine major, I'd seen my share of galas and ceremonies, but this one felt different. The room was filled with a mix of civilians in tailored suits and veterans in subdued attire, their faces etched with the quiet wisdom of experience. I wore my old work jacket over a simple shirt, my medals pinned discreetly, not for show, but as a nod to the cause. Hannah arrived in a shimmering dress, her laughter cutting through the crowd like a siren's call. Buoyed by the applause that followed her brief speech on innovative philanthropy. She thrived in these settings, where bold statements and sparkling toasts built her image as a mover in market circles. The tension had been simmering all evening, subtle at first, like the distant rumble of thunder over the Atlantic. Hannah had already made a few offhand comments during cocktail hour, dismissing the stories shared by rescue pilots as quaint tales from another era. My son shot me apologetic glances, but I held my peace, sipping water and listening to the conversations around me. Military service, as I'd learned through years of deployments and the psychological toll they exacted, often reshaped family dynamics in ways civilians couldn't grasp. Research on veterans returning from conflict zones highlighted how post-traumatic stress and emotional detachment could strain relationships, leading to conflicts rooted in misunderstanding and isolation. I saw echoes of that in our family. My quiet habits, born from adapting to civilian life after the chaos of service, clashed with Hannah's need for constant validation. But the breaking point arrived midway through the night, as the group mingled on the terrace overlooking the marina. The wind whistled through the rigging of nearby boats, carrying the faint scent of sea salt and diesel. Hannah, flushed from Prosecco and the adulation of her peers, turned her attention to me during a conversation about leadership in crises. An elderly Coast Guard captain, his uniform adorned with ribbons from decades of service, had just shared a story of a night rescue during a hurricane, much like the ones I'd coordinated in my Marine tenure. I nodded in quiet agreement, adding a brief comment on the importance of following orders in such chaos, how discipline, not bravado, often saved the day. That's when Hannah interjected, her voice laced with that familiar sarcasm, amplified by the alcohol and the crowd's attention. "Oh, come on, Tom," she said, gesturing dismissively at the medals on my chest. "Those are just vintage scrap, aren't they? Relics from a time when following orders was the height of ambition." The group fell into an awkward hush, but she pressed on, emboldened. Markets are built by the bold, not by those who follow orders. You can't innovate if you're stuck in the past. Her words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, reducing my service, years of leading teams through hellish conditions, making split-second decisions that preserved lives, to nothing more than outdated obedience. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, not from anger, but from the deep-seated recognition of disrespect that echoed the emotional strains described in studies on military families. Veterans often faced invalidation of their experiences upon returning home, leading to feelings of alienation and strained bonds. Hannah's quip wasn't just a joke, it was a public dismantling of my identity, in front of men and women who understood the weight of those vintage scraps. The elderly Coast Guard captain, his face paling, set down his glass with a quiet clink and slipped away from the group, excusing himself to the marina's edge where the wind could drown out the discomfort. His departure was a silent rebuke, a veteran recognizing when words crossed into sacrilege. In that moment, the gala's glamour faded, replaced by the raw reality of how my military past influenced our family. I'd seen it in my own readjustment after service, the hypervigilance, the preference for silence, the subtle tremors that Hannah mocked as shakes. Psychological analyses of combat veterans noted how such symptoms could lead to family conflicts, with partners misinterpreting emotional withdrawal as weakness. Hannah embodied that misunderstanding, her bold market-driven worldview clashing with the disciplined restraint that had kept me alive. My son stood nearby, his face a mask of conflict, torn between defending his fiancée and the father who had taught him resilience. He mumbled something about changing the subject, but the damage was done. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and I could sense the shift, the way eyes turned to me with quiet respect. Contrasting Hannah's flippant dismissal. I didn't argue back. That wasn't my way. Instead, I excused myself and stepped out onto the dock, where the marina wind whistled stronger, carrying the rhythmic slap of waves against hulls. The night air cleared my head, reminding me of deployments where silence in the face of provocation preserved unit cohesion. But inside, the breaking point solidified. This wasn't just about one evening, it was the culmination of patterns that threatened our family's core. Studies on wartime family dynamics emphasized how unresolved tensions, like disrespect toward a veteran's experiences, could escalate into broader relational breakdowns, affecting everything from communication to emotional support. Hannah's words echoed that, belittling the very foundation of who I was, a man shaped by orders that built not markets, but survival. As the gala continued behind me, with laughter resuming in forced tones, I reflected on the elderly captain's quiet exit. He represented a generation that understood, respect for service wasn't optional, it was the thread holding fractured lives together. Hannah's Prosecco-fueled boldness had unraveled that thread publicly, exposing the rift. My son joined me later, apologizing in hushed tones, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the dawning realization that her boldness masked a deeper insensitivity. The wind picked up, whistling through the masts like a warning, and I knew then that this night marked a turning point. Not in confrontation, but in the quiet resolve that some boundaries, once crossed, demanded action. The rest of the evening blurred into polite farewells, but the marina's whistle lingered in my mind, a harbinger of change. Military experience had taught me that breaking points often came not in battle, but in the quiet aftermath, where family relationships were tested most. Hannah's words had pushed us to that edge, and as we drove home in silence, I sensed the storm gathering, not one of wind and waves, but of choices that would redefine our home. I didn't argue. I made one call to an old search and rescue teammate and confirmed morning duties at the Patuxent River Air Park, presenting honors to crews who pulled survivors from the Marnie storm, and agreed to run a closed safety briefing for the state's aerial unit. Calm reshuffled the deck. The drive home from the gala was a silent one, the kind where the weight of unspoken words presses heavier than any storm. Hannah chattered on about the evening's successes, her voice bubbling with the remnants of Prosecco, while my son gripped the wheel, his knuckles white against the dashboard lights. I sat in the back, staring out at the passing harbor lights, feeling the marina wind still whistling in my ears like a distant warning. Her words, calling my medals vintage scrap and dismissing the discipline of service as outdated obedience, had cut deep, but I didn't rise to it. Arguing with someone buoyed by applause and alcohol would only feed the fire. Instead, I let the silence settle, drawing on the calm I'd honed through years of military service, where rash reactions could cost lives. Psychological studies on veterans often highlight this, the emotional detachment that follows combat, a survival mechanism that strains family ties but preserves inner strength in crisis. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the house loomed dark and familiar, its porch light casting long shadows over the old Jeep parked there like a steadfast companion. Hannah bid a quick goodnight, her heels clicking up the steps, oblivious to the rift she'd widened. My son lingered, murmuring an apology under his breath, but I just nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll talk tomorrow," I said simply, my voice steady. He nodded back, the conflict in his eyes mirroring the internal battles I'd seen in so many returning service members, torn between loyalty to a partner and the foundational respect owed to family. Research on military families underscores how such tensions can lead to emotional isolation, where veterans like me withdraw further, exacerbating feelings of alienation. Once inside, I didn't pace or stew. Anger wasn't my way. Action was. I retreated to my study, the small room lined with faded maps from deployments and a single framed photo of my unit during a rescue op in rough seas. The clock ticked past midnight, but sleep was far off. Instead, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years, Pete Ramirez, an old search and rescue teammate from my Marine days. We'd pulled each other through more than one hairy mission, coordinating evacuations under fire and in blinding storms. Pete had transitioned to civilian life running operations at the Patuxent River Air Park in Maryland, a hub for aerial rescue training and state emergency response. His voice crackled over the line, warm and unchanged despite the years. "Tom Harper? Hell, it's been too long. What's got you calling at this hour?" I kept it brief, no need for dramatics. "Pete, you still handling those honors ceremonies at the air park?" He chuckled, sensing the undercurrent. The Marnie storm, a brutal nor'easter that had ravaged the coast a few years back, claiming lives and testing rescue crews to their limits, was fresh in memory. Survivors had been plucked from churning waters by helicopter teams, much like the ops we'd run together. Pete confirmed they were presenting honors the next morning to the crews involved, a low-key event to recognize the quiet heroes who didn't seek spotlights. "Yeah, we're doing a presentation at 0800. Could use a steady hand like yours to say a few words, present the plaques, share some wisdom from the old days." That was the opening. I confirmed I'd be there, driving up at dawn if needed. But I pushed further, calm as ever. "And that closed safety briefing for the state's aerial unit? You mentioned needing a guest instructor last time we talked." Pete paused, then agreed without hesitation. The briefing was an internal session on updated protocols for high-risk extractions, drawing on real-world experience to prevent mishaps. My background in marine search and rescue made me a natural fit, years of leading teams through chaos, emphasizing the discipline Hannah had mocked. "You're in, Tom. It'll reshuffle the deck for these young pilots, remind them that following orders saves lives, not just bold moves." Hanging up, I felt the calm settle deeper, like the eye of a storm. This wasn't revenge, it was a deliberate step, a way to reaffirm my place without a single raised voice. Military service had reshaped my approach to family conflicts, teaching me that calm action often spoke louder than confrontation. As studies on post-combat adaptation note, veterans frequently channel emotional stress into structured routines, using discipline to navigate relational strains rather than explosive arguments. By committing to the air park duties, I was reshuffling the deck, not just for myself, but for my son, showing him that respect and impact came from quiet contributions, not flashy dismissals. The next morning dawned crisp, the kind of early light that reminded me of pre-mission briefings. I rose before the house stirred, brewing a pot of coffee and leaving a note for my son, heading to Patuxent for a commitment. Back by evening. We need to talk. The drive north was meditative, the highway cutting through fog-shrouded fields as I reflected on how my service had influenced our family dynamics. Deployments had meant long absences, leaving my late wife to hold things together, instilling in me a deep appreciation for the emotional toll on loved ones. Now, with Hannah's disrespect echoing those strains, I saw parallels in research on wartime families, how partners' misunderstandings of trauma symptoms, like my preference for silence, could erode bonds, leading to isolation or even breakdown. But I'd learned to counter it with purposeful engagement, like this trip. Arriving at Patuxent River Air Park, the familiar hum of rotors and scent of aviation fuel grounded me. Pete greeted me with a firm handshake, his eyes crinkling in that knowing way. The honors presentation was straightforward, a small gathering of crews in a hangar, plaques handed out to pilots and medics who'd braved the Marnie storm's fury. I presented them, my voice steady as I recounted a similar op from my days, emphasizing the chain of command that turned chaos into salvation. It's not about being bold alone, I said, the words a subtle counter to Hannah's gala barb. It's about trusting the team, following protocols that keep everyone coming home. Nods rippled through the group, a quiet affirmation that reshuffled my own sense of purpose. The closed safety briefing followed in a secure conference room, a select group of State Aerial Unit members, pilots, engineers, and coordinators, gathered around charts and simulators. I led it with the calm precision of old, drawing on experiences from Marine Ops to highlight risk assessments, communication under stress, and the psychological prep needed for high-stakes rescues. Veterans bring a unique lens, I explained, tying in how post-service adaptation affected decision-making. One young pilot shared his struggles with family reintegration after a deployment, echoing the emotional coldness and aggression noted in studies on combat returnees. I offered insights, stressing open communication as a bridge, advice I planned to share with my son. By afternoon, as I drove back, the deck felt reshuffled. This wasn't about upstaging Hannah, it was about demonstrating value through action. Calm had allowed me to step away from the toxicity, reaffirming connections that mattered. My phone buzzed with a text from Pete, "Good having you back in the fold. Doors always open." It was a reminder that my network, built on mutual respect, extended beyond family strife. Meanwhile, at home, I knew the conversation with my son loomed, one where I'd lay out the boundaries her disrespect had crossed, drawing from the resilience military life had forged in me. As the miles rolled by, I thought of how service had forever altered my family role, the hypervigilance that made me observant, the emotional barriers that sometimes distanced me, but also the unwavering commitment to protect those I loved. Hannah's world of bold markets couldn't touch that depth. Calm had reshuffled everything, setting the stage for what came next, not in anger, but in quiet strength. Whist 1, over the speaker, a city coordinator announced the new peer would be named for my partner who died on a night rescue. Hannah tried a quip, but a guest pilot recognized me and recalled how my safety notes helped avert a training disaster, and the room's temperature changed. The morning after the gala, with the taste of unresolved tension still lingering like salt on the wind, I returned from Patuxent River Air Park feeling a quiet realignment in my bones. The honors presentation and safety briefing had been more than duties, they were anchors, reminders of a life built on substance over show. My son was waiting on the porch when I pulled up in the old Jeep, his face drawn from a sleepless night. Hannah, predictably, was inside, scrolling through her phone, oblivious or indifferent to the undercurrents. We didn't dive into confrontation right away. Instead, over coffee in the kitchen, I shared details of the Air Park event, how presenting honors to those storm rescuers had stirred memories of my own deployments, the kind where discipline and quiet resolve turned potential disasters into survivals. He listened, nodding, but I could see the weight of Hannah's words from the night before pressing on him. Military service, as I'd come to understand through years of reflection and the psychological scars it left, often reshaped family bonds in subtle, enduring ways, fostering emotional detachment that could either isolate or strengthen ties depending on how it was navigated. That evening, the city had scheduled a follow-up event, a modest dedication ceremony at the harbor, tied to the charity gala's themes but more intimate, focused on local heroes and infrastructure improvements. It was held at the waterfront, where a new pier was being unveiled as part of ongoing efforts to bolster coastal resilience after recent storms. I hadn't planned to attend initially, but Pete's call from Patuxent had looped in a connection. One of the guest speakers was a coordinator from the city's emergency management office, and word had spread about my involvement in the morning's briefing. My son insisted we go as a family, perhaps sensing it as a chance to mend fences or at least air them out. Hannah agreed with a shrug, seeing it as another networking opportunity, her agency friends likely to be in attendance. As we arrived, the sun dipped low over the marina, casting golden hues on the gathered crowd, veterans, rescuers, local officials, and a smattering of civilians. The air hummed with the low murmur of conversations, punctuated by the occasional cry of gulls and the lap of water against pilings. We found seats near the front, the setup simple, a podium with a speaker system, flanked by banners honoring search and rescue efforts. Hannah fidgeted beside my son, her dress a stark contrast to the practical attire of the attendees, whispering about how quaint the whole thing was. I sat quietly, my worn jacket a comfortable shield, scanning the faces for familiar ones from my Marine days. The event began with remarks from the city coordinator, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd coordinated responses to multiple disasters. She spoke of community strength, the unsung work that kept the coast safe, and then, over the speaker, she made the announcement that hit like a rogue wave: the new pier would be named in honor of Sergeant Elias Grant, my old partner from a night rescue operation gone tragically wrong years ago. Elias had been more than a teammate, he'd been a brother in arms, lost when our chopper went down in blinding rain during an evacuation, sacrificing to ensure the rest of us made it out. The coordinator's voice crackled through the speakers, detailing his heroism, how he'd stabilized survivors mid-flight, his final actions saving lives even as the storm claimed him. The words washed over me, stirring a deep well of memories I'd long kept contained. Elias's death had been a turning point in my service, amplifying the psychological toll that studies on combat veterans describe: the survivor's guilt, the hypervigilance, the way such losses ripple into family life, creating emotional barriers that partners and children struggle to breach. I'd never spoken much of it at home, not wanting to burden my son, but hearing his name now, etched into something permanent like that pier, felt like a quiet vindication, a recognition that the vintage scrap Hannah mocked carried weight beyond her comprehension. The crowd applauded softly, a respectful murmur rising, but Hannah, ever the opportunist for a quip, leaned over to my son with a smirk. "A pier for a night rescue? How dramatic! Next they'll name a bench after every order follower who got wet." Her voice was low but carried in the hush, intended as light-hearted banter, but it landed like a misfired round, drawing sharp glances from nearby veterans. Before the discomfort could spread, a guest pilot, a burly man in his 40s, clad in a flight jacket adorned with unit patches, turned from a few seats away, his eyes widening in recognition. "Major Harper? Tom Harper from the old SAR Ops?" He stood, extending a hand, his voice booming enough to shift the room's focus. I'd crossed paths with him years back during a joint training exercise at Patuxent, where I'd shared safety notes on rotor downdraft risks in stormy conditions. He introduced himself as Captain Reyes, now with the state's aerial unit, and without missing a beat, he recounted how those very notes had averted a training disaster just months prior. "We were simulating a Marnie-level storm extraction," he said, addressing the group as heads turned. "High winds, low visibility, textbook setup for a crash. But your protocols, Major, the ones on calibrated descent and team checks, they caught a rotor imbalance before it escalated. Saved the bird, saved the crew. You're a legend in our briefings." The room's temperature changed in an instant, a palpable shift from polite formality to genuine respect. Murmurs of agreement rippled out, veterans nodding, officials leaning in with interest. Hannah's quip hung forgotten, her face flushing as the coordinator, overhearing, invited me to the podium for an impromptu remark. I rose slowly, not for drama, but because moments like this demanded steadiness. At the speaker. I kept it brief, honoring Elias not with flowery words, but with the truth of his sacrifice, the way he'd embodied the discipline that built resilience, much like the pier now bearing his name would withstand future storms. I tied it to the broader impact of military service on families, how losses like his echoed in emotional strains at home, the aggression, the withdrawal, the challenges in rebuilding connections that research highlights as common for returning service members. It's not about boldness alone, I said, echoing my earlier thoughts, but about the quiet actions that hold everything together. The applause was warmer now, sustained, and as I returned to my seat, Reyes clapped me on the back, others following suit with handshakes and shared stories. Hannah sat rigid, her attempt at levity dissolved into the background, while my son looked at me with a mix of pride and dawning realization, the kind that reshapes family dynamics when hidden strengths surface. The room's changed temperature lingered through the rest of the event, conversations buzzing with references to my contributions, invitations to future briefings pouring in. It wasn't triumph, it was a twist of fate, underscoring how my past, often dismissed, held real impact. Hannah tried to recover with small talk afterward, but her words fell flat, the group's focus elsewhere. My son pulled me aside later, his voice low. I didn't know about Elias, or how much you've done. It opened a door, one that military families often struggle with, bridging the gap between service experiences and home life, where misunderstandings can fester into conflicts. As we walked back to the Jeep, the pier's new sign gleaming in the fading light, I felt the deck reshuffling further, not through confrontation, but through the quiet revelation of truth. Whist 2, the charity's accountant revealed my small engineering startup had modernized emergency beacons and drone repeaters on a municipal contract, with profits routed to scholarships for rescuers' children. The figure was modest, but the point wasn't gloss, it was impact, and her failed father narrative collapsed. The evening at the pier dedication had already set a new tone, with Elias's name immortalized and Captain Reyes's recognition turning the spotlight on my understated contributions. As the crowd began to disperse, the marina lights flickering on against the deepening dusk, the charity's accountant, Mr. Ellis, lingered near our group. He was a meticulous figure, his tie slightly askew from the day's events, but his eyes sharp with the precision of someone who dealt in numbers and their hidden stories. Hannah hovered nearby, her earlier quip about the pier naming still hanging awkwardly in the air, though she tried to brush it off with forced small talk. My son stood between us, his posture a bridge of quiet tension, absorbing the shifts like he always did, caught in the crosscurrents of loyalty and awakening truth. I remained calm, the salt air grounding me, drawing on the emotional resilience forged through years of service where revelations often came not in bursts, but in steady unveilings. Mr. Ellis approached with a nod, clipboard in hand, addressing not just me but the small cluster of rescuers and officials still milling about. "Folks, before we call it a night," he began, his voice steady over the gentle waves lapping at the new pier, "I need to shine a light on something that's been quietly making waves, pun intended." He adjusted his glasses, scanning his notes. Major Tom Harper, through his engineering startup, Harper Tech Solutions, landed a municipal contract last year to overhaul our emergency beacons and drone repeaters. These aren't flashy gadgets, they're lifesavers, modernized for better signal integrity in storms, integrating drone tech for extended range and real-time data relay. He detailed how the upgrades had been rolled out across coastal units, reducing blackout risks in high-wind scenarios by integrating GPS with automated repeaters, allowing rescuers to pinpoint distress signals faster amid chaos like the Marnie storm. The group leaned in, murmurs of interest rising. Ellis continued, his tone laced with genuine admiration. "But here's where it gets even better. The profits from that contract? Major Harper directed them entirely into scholarships for children of rescuers, funding education in fields like engineering and emergency management. He cited the figure, a modest $50,000 over the fiscal year, enough to support 4 scholarships so far, with recipients already enrolled in programs that would carry forward the legacy of service. It's not about the dollar amount, Ellis emphasized, it's the impact, equipping the next generation, honoring the families who sacrifice alongside their loved ones." Applause broke out, subdued but heartfelt, with Reyes adding, that's the real deal, turning experience into something that lasts. The city coordinator chimed in, noting how the tech had already proven its worth in a recent drill, potentially averting what could have been a catastrophic failure. This revelation hit like a controlled detonation, precise and transformative. Hannah's narrative of me as the failed father, the outdated veteran with his relics and shakes, someone who'd supposedly squandered his potential in silence while she built empires of bold innovation, crumbled in real time. She'd peddled this story subtly but persistently, whispers to my son about my lack of ambition, jokes at dinners framing my quiet life as a cautionary tale of following orders into obscurity. But here, exposed under the marina lights, was the truth. My small startup, born in the garage from late-night sketches inspired by deployment mishaps, wasn't failure, it was purposeful evolution. Military service had wired me this way. Studies on veteran psychological adaptation show how combat experiences often channel into innovative problem-solving, turning trauma into tools that benefit communities and ease family strains through meaningful contribution. Hannah's face tightened, her usual poise cracking as she attempted a recovery. "Well, that's quite the side hustle," she said with a forced smile, trying to inject her signature quip, but it landed hollow, overshadowed by the group's nods and handshakes directed at me. The point wasn't gloss or grandeur, no press releases, no fanfare, just impact, the kind that echoed the quiet heroism Elias represented. One rescuer, a father himself, approached to thank me personally. "My boy's one of those scholarship kids, heading to tech school next fall. Means the world after what we've been through." It humanized the numbers, tying back to the emotional toll of service on families, the absences, the worries, the way veterans like me processed guilt and loss by building legacies that supported others. My son turned to me, eyes wide with a mix of awe and regret. "Dad, all this time, the startup, the scholarships, you never mentioned." I met his gaze steadily. "Didn't need to. It's not for show." It was a lesson in the making, rooted in how military experience reshapes family dynamics, fostering emotional coldness or withdrawal as coping mechanisms, but also enabling profound, altruistic acts that rebuild connections when revealed. Hannah's narrative collapsed further as conversations swirled, officials discussing potential expansions of my tech, rescuers sharing stories of similar quiet innovators from their ranks. She stood isolated, her agency polish suddenly superficial against the backdrop of tangible good. The twist deepened as we mingled. A young engineer from the municipal team pulled me aside, explaining how my drone repeaters had integrated seamlessly with existing systems, drawing from battlefield comms protocols I'd adapted. It wasn't bold market disruption, it was disciplined innovation, born from nights replaying ops where signals failed, lives hung in balance. Psychological analyses of wartime families highlight this. Veterans often redirect hypervigilance into protective endeavors, like scholarships that shield rescuers' children from financial fallout, countering the isolation that strains relationships. Hannah tried engaging, pivoting to talk of scaling my work, but her words rang insincere, the group politely steering back to impact over profit. As the night wound down, the marina quieting under stars, the collapse felt complete. Hannah's failed father tale lay in ruins, replaced by a narrative of quiet strength, profits modest, but lives touched immeasurably. My son walked with me to the jeep, Hannah trailing silently, the air thick with unspoken reevaluation. It wasn't vengeance, it was clarity, the kind military life teaches through endurance. The deck had reshuffled, favoring substance, and in that modest figure lay a profound shift, mending family rifts. One revealed truth at a time. That my son ended the engagement, and I returned to a house where things remember those who didn't. The porch held only mist and quiet, not punishment or revenge, but a boundary lesson. The quiet man may be the last to stand when the noise dies and the first to leave when respect runs out. The days following the peer dedication and the accountant's revelation unfolded like the slow clearing of fog after a storm. Hannah's facade, once so polished and unassailable, began to crack under the weight of exposed truths. My son, who had always been the mediator, wrestling with loyalties divided between his fiancée's bold world and the steady foundation I'd provided, finally saw the fractures clearly. We talked late into the night on the porch, the same one where I'd sat through countless evenings processing the echoes of service, memories of lost comrades like Elias, the psychological scars that studies on veterans describe as leading to emotional detachment and strained family bonds. I didn't push, I simply shared how her dismissals, from mocking my medals to belittling my startup's impact, eroded the respect that held our family together. Military life had taught me that relationships, like missions, required mutual trust. Without it, everything crumbled. Research on wartime families highlights this. Unresolved conflicts, born from misunderstandings of a veteran's quiet resilience, often escalate into breakdowns, with emotional coldness masking deeper pains. He listened, his face etched with the conflict I'd seen in so many young men navigating post-service dynamics. Hannah tried to salvage things the next morning, cornering him with apologies laced in agency jargon, promises of change, reframing her quips as misunderstood humor. But the scholarships, the tech upgrades, the recognition from peers like Reyes, it all painted a picture she couldn't gloss over. My failed father, label dissolved, replaced by evidence of quiet impact that supported rescuers' families, countering the isolation veterans often face upon reintegration. By evening, after a tense conversation I stayed out of, my son made his choice. He ended the engagement, his voice steady as he told her it was over, not out of spite, but because respect couldn't be rebuilt on foundations of mockery. She left in a flurry of accusations, her car peeling out of the driveway, leaving silence in her wake. I returned to the house alone that night, the familiar creak of the door a reminder of absences, things that remembered those who didn't come back, like Elias's empty chair in my mind, or the faded photos of my unit lining the walls. The porch held only mist rolling in from the harbor and the profound quiet I'd come to cherish, a sanctuary shaped by years of adapting to civilian life. It wasn't punishment or revenge. Hannah's departure was a boundary lesson, hard-earned through service. Veterans' experiences often strain family ties, fostering aggression or withdrawal, but they also teach endurance, standing firm when noise fades. The quiet man, I'd learned, may be the last to stand when chaos subsides, and the first to leave when respect runs dry. In that mist-shrouded peace, our home felt whole again, grounded in actions over ornaments.